let me tell you where we have come from in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, we've talked about the Beatitudes, and they are laying out the basic character of the disciple. Then, following that, in verses 13 through 16, we have the purpose of that character that's formed in the Beatitudes, and that is becoming God's salt and light in a world that needs it. In verses 17 through 19, Jesus makes an announcement that all of this is connected to the Old Testament, and that He did not come to abolish, but to fulfill those things. So you have the character of a disciple, becoming salt and light, the purpose of the character, fulfilling and tying together the Old Testament promises and prophecies, and Jesus is the culminating point of all of those things. And then in Matthew 5 and verse 20, He gives a declaration about righteousness, the kind of righteousness that allows one entrance into the kingdom of heaven that is now upon them. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And they had missed the mark. They were misunderstanding a lot of that, misunderstanding Old Testament teaching and its application. And they had a shallow understanding of righteousness. So Jesus is going to be giving them 6 examples of how they'd missed that mark. And He talks about things like anger and murder and adultery, and some things about marriage and divorce, and about false vows and retaliation, and how they should love their enemies and pray for them. And so He's giving 6 illustrations of how they need to exceed the kind of righteousness portrayed by the Jewish leaders of His day. And it's introduced with that phrase, you've heard that it was said, but I say unto you. So He's straightening all of that out. Now we come to chapter 6. And that phrase is being put to bed. We don't run into that anymore. You've heard that it was said, but I say unto you. We're not dealing with that phrase, but we're still talking about righteousness. We're still having Matthew 5:20 in view, that our righteousness needs to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. And so now He's talking about religious forms that they were using. And He has 3 illustrations of that. He's talking about how they would give. He talks about how they would pray. He talks about how they would fast. That's going to carry us through about the first 18 verses of Matthew chapter 6. And so we have an introductory statement that He gives us in verse 1. Beware of practicing your righteousness. I think the King James there has alms. Your righteousness, your alms. The idea is they're doing right things for wrong reasons. So beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. And so He's going to be talking about these outward things that they did, but there's a disconnect going on. There's something that's not connecting on the inside. And so He's using these 3 things as an illustration of that and what the Father expects. We should notice that religion that is mainly to promote oneself in the eyes of other people, but is not promoting and honoring God in the eyes of other people, is unworthy. It is hypocrisy. And you have the word hypocrisy coming up in verse 2, verse 5, and verse 16. To do it the way they were doing it reeks of hypocrisy. And so He's telling them how it ought to be done to honor God. If we want a spotlight for religious activity, if we want the compliments of other people, and God's taking a back seat in all of that to my performance, that is hypocrisy. If I'm doing something different in public than what is normally taking place with me in private. That's hypocrisy, and it's not real. Any comments there before we get into verse 2 and following? All right. We are looking first at when we give. Excuse me. So when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. The first thing I want to draw our attention to is the word reward. You find it in verse 2, and you find it again in verse 4. The interesting thing is the word reward in the original language is different. It's translated the same in my English translation, reward, reward. But the actual word is a different word in the Greek text. There is a difference in the way it's being used from verse 2 to verse 4. Verse 2 is the idea that they're going into this sort of cutting a deal. They are earning their wage. They're going into it for something, and they're getting that something out of it. So in verse 2, you have your reward in full. You've wanted to cut a deal in the way you did this. You wanted to earn your wage. And your wage was, the reason you were doing it is, you wanted to be noticed by men. And you wanted their approval, you wanted their applause, you got what you were after, and you're not getting any more out of it than that. In verse 4, the reward is of a different kind. It's a different term. It's the idea of giving back and restoring. It's done for a different reason. It has a different end to it. And God's involved in that. But He's not involved in the first one. And so there's a little nuance of difference in the word reward from verse 2 to verse 4. And then we have what I would call two-handed giving that comes up in verse 3. In verse 2, it's the sounding of a trumpet. We're not to sound a trumpet before us as we're giving. So the idea there is you're drawing attention. Before you do it, you're drawing attention to it. You want everybody to give their gaze to what you're about to do. So there is an outside to that. And then in verse 3, you have this, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. I call that two-handed giving. And the idea is with one hand you're giving this, but with the other hand you're calculating what it's worth. So don't do it with that preconceived, purpose that I'm going to give this, I want to sound the trumpet, be sure everybody's looking when I do it, and then when I'm giving it with one hand, I'm calculating what it's worth with the other hand, the two-handed giver. And so there's both ideas there. I want to call attention with the trumpet, and then I have an ulterior motive. And that's like, I've used this before, this illustration, that you go someplace and there's a tip jar there on the counter. And the worker is there, maybe they're getting food for you or something like that, and there's a tip jar there. When do you put money in the tip jar? Well, I want them to see that I'm doing it. And so that's the idea of the two-handed giver, and making sure someone notices when you're doing that. I think the churches of Macedonia, you remember that in 2 Corinthians 8. This is a great illustration of what giving ought to be. And so I'd like you to turn to that text if you'd like to. You don't have to. You can just listen to me if I'm that fascinating. But I think you'll find the Bible text more impressive than my voice. So 2 Corinthians chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which has been given in the churches of Macedonia. Macedonia, a region, an area, and congregations that were gathering in that region. That in a great ordeal of affliction Their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. So they're struggling to make ends meet. They don't have a lot. They're in poverty, and they're trying to just get by day, but they're giving, and the giving that they're doing is toward their brethren of Judea. There's a great need there, and they're giving to it. These are primarily Gentile congregations giving to Jewish brethren, and so it's really astounding to see this happening. Paul's thrilled over it because he's trying to bring together Jewish and Gentile brethren. And so this is a great opportunity, and Paul calls them out for this, that there's something really magnificent you need to see with this, and it overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. And then in verse 4, that they gave themselves first to the Lord in doing it. That's their motivation. That's the idea behind it. And they're thrilled that they've been able to hear the gospel of Christ, respond to it, have their sins washed away, be counted as one in the body of Christ. This is so exciting to them, and this all came from Jewish brethren, this great opportunity, and they just want to help them now. They have a physical need, a material need, and they want to give to it. And even in their deep poverty, it's just overflowing, overflowing in their giving. And the word liberality is used. I don't know if everybody's translation has the word liberality at the end of verse 2. Does anybody have anything different than liberality? End of verse 2. Generosity, liberality. It can be kind of misleading. Did they give a lot? Well, it appears as though they did. The idea is there that, at least in their case, with what they had to work with, they gave very generously, but the word liberality has more behind it than that. The main point of that term is not how much they gave, but their motivation in giving. The term liberality, or in some translations generosity, has something behind it that's really important. The basic meaning of the Greek term there is simplicity, not duplicity, not ulterior motive, not the two-handed giving, not sounding of the trumpet, but they gave with a simplicity, not a duplicity. No ulterior motive involved. Singleness of heart, purity. And so that's where it comes from. That's where their giving came from. And that's what made it so wonderful. So if your Bible translation says generosity or liberality, you might want to make a note somewhere that it has to do with simplicity, with a genuineness, and it comes from giving themselves first to God. There's no ulterior motive involved in it. Now, there's a form of that same word that you'll find translated in Colossians 3:22. Colossians 3:22. Again, your translation may be a little bit different, and I'd be interested to know if it is. Galatians 3:22 and 23. Slaves, in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Now that word sincerity, slaves, when you serve your masters, don't do that with just external service as though you're trying to please your master. Have more behind it than that. Do this with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. And whatever you do, do your work heartily from the soul as for the Lord rather than for men. That word sincerity is a form of the Greek term that's translated liberality in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 2. Liberality, sincerity, simplicity. In Colossians 3:22 and 23, do it from the heart as to the Lord. If you connect the idea in Colossians 3:22 and 23 with that word liberality or generosity in 2 Corinthians 8:2, you'll get the idea. This is what made their giving so wonderful. And it's very different than what Jesus is presenting in Matthew chapter 6, where they're sounding a trumpet, and they're two-handed giving where they're calculating what it's worth in the eyes of other people and what they're going to get out of it from the approval of men. So the idea there, hopefully we get that by comparing some passages. Now you also have the word secret used in chapter 6, twice in verse 4, twice in verse 6, and twice in verse 18 about giving in secret. So in verse 6, when you're praying, go to your inner room, close your door, pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And sometimes people get the idea from that of literally going into a closet and shutting the door so nobody can see you. Very private in your prayers. And we need to be careful about taking it too literal there. Some people think that maybe that means if you go out to a restaurant on Sunday afternoon, you're going to have lunch, that the meal comes to the table. You ought not to pray so people can see you, and you certainly don't want them to hear your voice. That's not what this is talking about. This idea of praying in secret or giving in secret or fasting in secret, your Father who sees what's done in secret will reward you, openly. That word secret is translated different in Romans 2:29. And again, I need you to put your finger in Matthew 6 and go with me to Romans chapter 2, verse 29. Watch this, and we'll get the idea. But he who is a Jew, who is one inwardly. The word for secret is translated inwardly. He who is a Jew, who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not of the letter. His praise is not from men, but from God. So when it comes to our giving, do it in secret, not sounding a trumpet, not calculating with one hand what the other hand's doing, wanting to be noticed by men. Make sure that you have engaged the inward person, that you've engaged the heart. Giving that doesn't come from us inwardly, that's the secret place. If it's not engaging your heart, what's going on inside you, it just becomes an outward, external thing that you're doing for an external reward. If it doesn't engage you inwardly, that is hypocrisy. The giving has no worth in the sight of God. The praying has no worth in the sight of God. The fasting has no worth in the sight of God. It's not come from the inside, from the heart, from a place of genuineness. It's given for external show more than anything else. It's a true longing and desire, not because someone's watching and expecting someone. I saw a commercial the other day, and it made me laugh, and it made me think of their style of giving that Jesus is correcting. The commercial was for McDonald's. And there was a fella in line in the drive-thru in his car, and he was ordering some piddly little thing. And he gets to the window, and he looks in his rearview mirror, and there's a guy in a real nice vehicle behind him. And he looks at the person at the window who's going to take his money and says, I want to pay it forward. I want to take care of that guy's bill behind me. I'm going to pay it forward. And so he gives his credit card, and the person checking him out says, okay, that's great. And so he no more gets done with that, and he is in a real hurry. He's almost perspiring. And he guns his car as fast as he can. He cuts off another lady. He's trying to get around the building to get behind this guy that he just paid it forward to. And he's thinking this guy will now pay it forward for the car behind him. And he runs up a bill of like $680. And the guy in the car in front of him recognizes the car and the guy. And he gets out to confront him, and the guy, no, you have to do it. I did it for you. Yeah. And it didn't work out. And that reminded me of this giving that Jesus is talking about, where they're trying to get something out of it from somebody else, and God's not going to give any reward for that. Our righteousness needs to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. We can't be doing stuff for a show and for human applause. And sometimes that becomes very literal today. There's more and more applause in churches. And you have to consider what's going on there. I won't say much more about it, just to let you think about how there's more and more applause going on in churches today. Well, what is our gathering about? What are we trying to accomplish? Who are we trying to worship? Who are we trying to honor? Applause is very different than what it's supposed to be about. And it is rewarding a person rather than honoring God. Just pause and think about that a little bit and how prevalent that is these days in so many places. So Jesus is correcting some things there. Now, we get down to prayer. Any comments on the giving before we move on from that? All right, we get down to verse 5, and let's read verses 5 through 8. When you pray, we've talked about giving. Now, when you pray, you're not to be like the hypocrites. They love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that, here's the reason, here's what they're after, so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your inner room, close your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now remember, secret, God is looking within us. While we're doing these things, God is looking within. That's the secret place. He's looking within us, our heart. Where's it coming from? What's going on the inside? This is the secret place God's looking at. And verse 7, when you're praying, do not use meaningless repetition as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words. So do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. So there's a hypocritical way to pray. And it wants to be very visible. And it wants to draw attention. It wants it to be an attention-drawing activity. And they love to stand so they can be seen and stand on the street corners and have people notice them. And so he's saying that's the wrong idea of what prayer ought to be. And I want you to think about, is he saying it's wrong to pray in public? Think about that. That doesn't make sense, does it? It's not about praying in public. That's not the issue. There's a purpose they had in mind, and it's the purpose they had in mind, the reasoning they had, that makes it wrong. So think about verse 5 and what it's teaching, so they may be seen by men. But compare it to Matthew 5, verse 16. Let your light shine before men. Let them see it. Let them see your light in such a way, in this way, that they may see your good works, whatever they might be. Giving, praying, fasting, whatever it might be. Let your light shine in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. Your Father who's in heaven. Your so that is to honor and glorify God. To take attention off you and put the attention on God. That's the so that of Matthew 5:16. But in Matthew 6, their praying is so that they may be seen by men, the end. No pointing to God. Not to draw their attention to God. Just to be seen by men and to be rewarded by men for what they're doing. That's the end of their activity and their reasoning in chapter 6. So there's a big distinction between Matthew 5:16, and what they were doing, the hypocrites, in chapter 6 in their prayer life. So if the secret place is not engaged, then the praying is for the wrong purpose. God's not in view, and the goal is wrong. Then there is the error of the Gentiles in verse 7. What was the problem with the Gentiles in verse 7? Yeah, and I'm glad you didn't just say repetition. The word meaningless is key. It's meaningless repetition. Is there anything wrong with repetition? Well, Jesus repeated himself almost word for word in the Garden of Gethsemane 3 times. You have Paul with his thorn in the flesh repeating himself 3 times. You have a parable in Luke chapter 18 of a widow coming before an unjust judge and almost nagging him into helping her, and Jesus is using it as a lesson about prayer and how we always ought to pray and never to cease praying, even if it's saying the same thing over and over again. The problem is when it becomes meaningless repetition. So that's the real issue. Gentiles were praying in a meaningless way. And you might think about 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 26. That is Mount Carmel with the false prophets of Baal. And for hours, they were calling on Baal, just the same thing, just over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Meaningless repetition. That's how the Gentiles pray. It was just a big show at Mount Carmel, but had no real connection or purpose. And there's other illustrations like that we just don't have time for this evening. You might think about this. Sometimes we make notes for prayer. I've done it. Others have done it. Anything wrong with making notes for prayer? If the note becomes a performance rather than a reminder, there's a problem. But notes to remind us of prayer and things we need to pray about because we get nervous and flustered and sometimes forget, nothing wrong with that. It's not meaningless repetition. But sometimes notes become very flowery. And people want to make flowery notes to read them as flowery prayers to make a flowery impression. Now you're getting into the territory of Matthew 6. And we need to be very careful of those kinds of things. Examples of meaningless repetition: praying just because it's time to pray. Praying to put a check mark on my responsibility. I've been assigned prayer, and I want to put a check mark by my box. I remember to say prayer at a certain time. Opening prayer, closing prayer, and just because it's time to pray. We want to be careful about that. Praying memorized prayers that roll off the tongue rather than rolling forth from the heart. Those would be examples of things we ought to be very cautious about. A lot of times our prayers are repetitious. I have my prayer time every morning when I start out my day. And they are very similar from morning to morning because the issues are the same. And you may have prayers like that as well. This is not telling us we can't repeat things in prayer that are current and real and genuine. But let's not allow them to become meaningless as just terminology that rolls off the tongue without thinking through it with mind and heart. We'll follow up on this next week. Thank you for your attention. We are dismissed.